Brave New World, Chapter 12. Bernard had to shout through the locked door. The savage would not open. But everybody's there, waiting for you. Let them wait, came back the muffled voice through the door. But you know quite well, John, how difficult it is to sound persuasive at the top of one's voice. I'm asking them on purpose to meet you. You ought to have asked me first whether I wanted to meet them. But you always came before, John. That's precisely why I don't want to come again. Just please, Bernard bellowingly wheedled. Wouldn't you please? Won't you please? Won't you come to please me? No. Do you seriously mean it? Yes, despairingly. But what shall I do? Bernard wailed. Go to hell, bawled the exasperated voice from within. But the arch community songster of Canterbury is there tonight. Bernard was almost in tears. Ayataquai. It was only in Zunyai that the savage could adequately express how he felt about the arch community songster. Hanai, he added as an afterthought, and then, with what derisive curiosity, Sans eso tse na, and he spat on the ground, as Pope might have done. In the end, Bernard had to slink back, diminished, to his room and inform the impatient assembly that the savage would not be appearing this evening. The news was received with indignation. The men were furious at having been tricked into behaving politely to this insignificant fellow with the unsavory reputation and the heretical opinions. The higher their position in the hierarchy, the deeper their resentment. To play such a joke on me, the arch songster kept repeating, on me. As for the women, they indignantly felt that they had been had on false pretense, had by a wretched little man who had had alcohol poured into his bottle by mistake, by a creature of with gamma minus physique. It was an outrage, and they said so more and more loudly. The headmistress of Eton was particularly scathing. Lenina alone said nothing. Pale, her blue eyes clouded with an unwonted melancholy. She sat in a corner, cut off from those who surrounded her by an emotion which they did not share. She could have come to the party filled with strange feelings of anxious exultation. In a few minutes, she had said to herself, and she entered the room, I shall be seeing him, talking to him, telling him, for she had come with her mind made up, that I like him more than anybody I've ever known, and perhaps he'll say, what would he say? The blood had rushed to her cheeks. Why, he was so strange the other night after the feelie, so queer, and yet I'm absolutely sure that he really does rather like me, I'm sure. And in this moment that Bernard had made his announcement, the savage wasn't coming to the party. Lenina suddenly felt all the sensations normally expressed at the beginning of a violent passion surrogate treatment, a sense of dreadful emptiness, a breathless apprehension, a nausea. Her heart seemed to stop beating. Perhaps it's because he doesn't like me, she said to herself, and at once this possibility became an established certainty. John had refused to come because he didn't like her. He didn't like her. It really is a bit too thick, the headmistress of Eton was saying to the director of crematoria and phosphorus reclamation. When I think that I actually... Yes, came the voice of Fanny Crown. It's absolutely true about the alcohol. Someone I know knew someone who was working in the embryo store at the time. She said to my friend, and my friend said to me, too bad, said Henry Foster, sympathizing with the arch community songster. It may interest you to know that our ex-director was on the point of transferring him to Iceland. Pierced by every word that was spoken, the tight balloon of Bernard's happy self-confidence was leaking from 1,000 wounds. Pale, distraught, abject, agitated, he moved among the guests, stammering incoherently, apologizing, assuring them that the next time the savage would certainly be there, begging them to sit down, take a carotene sandwich, a slice of vitamin A pate, a glass of champagne surrogate. They duly ate but ignored him, drank, and were either rude to his face or talked to one another about him, loudly and offensively, as though he had not been there. And now, my friends, said the arch community songster of Canterbury, in that beautiful ringing voice with which he had led the proceeding at Ford's Day celebration. Now, my friends, I think perhaps the time has come. He rose, put down his glass, brushed from his purple viscose waistcoat the crumbs of considerable consolation, and walked towards the door. Bernard darted forward to intercept him. Must you really, arch songster? It's very early still. I'd hope you would. Yes, wouldn't you have hoped? When Lena confidently told the community songster would accept an invitation if it was sent. He's really rather sweet, you know. And she had shown Bernard the little golden zipper fastening in the form of a T, which the arch songster had given to her as a memento of the weekend she had spent at Lambeth. To meet the arch community songster of Canterbury and Mr. Savage. Bernard had proclaimed his triumph of every invitation card, but the savage had chosen this evening of all evenings to lock himself up in his room, to shout, Hanai, Hanai. And even it was lucky that Bernard didn't understand Zuni, son eso tsenai. What would have been the crowning moment of Bernard's whole career had turned out to be the moment of his greatest humiliation. I'd so hoped, he stammered repeatedly, looking up at the great dignitary with pleading and distracting eyes. My young friend, said the arch community songster in a tone loud and solemn severity, of loud and solemn severity. There was a general silence. Let me give you a word of advice. He wagged his little finger at Bernard. Before it's too late. A word of good advice. His voice became sepulchre. Mend your ways, my young friend, mend your ways. He made the sign of the T over him, turned away. Lenina, my dear, he called in another tone, come with me. Obediently but unsmilingly and wholly insensible of the honor done to her, without emotion, Lenina walked after him out of the room. The other guests followed at a respectful interval. The last of them slammed the door. Bernard was alone. Punctured, utterly deflated, he dropped into a chair and, covering his face with his hands, began to weep. A few minutes later, however, he thought better of it and took 4 tablets of soma. Upstairs in his room, the savage was reading Romeo and Juliet. Lenina and the arch community songster stepped out onto the roof of Lambeth Palace. Hurry up, my friend, Lenina, called the arch community songster impatiently from the lifted gates. Lenina, who had lingered for a moment to look at the moon, dropped her eyes and came hurrying across the roof to rejoin her. A New Theory of Biology was the title of the paper which Mustafa Mond had just finished reading. He sat for some time meditatively frowning, then picked up his pen and wrote across the title. The author's mathematical treatment of the conception of purpose is novel, highly ingenious, but heretical, and, so far as the present social order is concerned, dangerous and potentially subversive. Not to be published. He underlined the words. The author was to be kept under supervision. His transference to Marine Biology Station of St. Helena may become necessary. A pity, he thought, as he signed his name. It was a masterly piece of work, but once you begin admitting explanations in terms of purpose, well, you didn't know what the result might be. It was the sort of idea that might easily decondition the more unsettled mind among the highest caste, make them lose their faith in happiness as the sovereign good, and take to believing instead that the goal was somewhere beyond, somewhere outside the present human sphere, that the purpose of life was not the maintenance of well-being, but some intensification and refining of consciousness, some enlargement of knowledge, which was, the controller reflected, quite possibly true, but not, in the present circumstances, admissible. He picked up his pen again, and under the words, not to be published, drew a second line, thicker, blacker than the first, then signed. What fun it would be, he thought, if one didn't have to think about happiness. With closed eyes, his face shining with rapture, John was softly declaiming to vacancy. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night, like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. The golden T lay shining on Lenina's brows. Sportively, the arch community songster caught hold of it. Sportively, he pulled. I think, said Lenina suddenly, breaking a long silence, I better take a couple of grams of soma. Bernard, by this time, was fast asleep and smiling at the private paradise of his dreams. Smiling, but inexorably, every 30 seconds, the minute hand of the electric clock above his bed jumped forward with an almost imperceptible click. Click, click, click. And it was morning. Bernard was back among the miseries of space and time. It was the lowest spirit that he'd taxied across to his work at the conditioning center. The intoxication of success had evaporated. He was soberly his old self, and by contrast with the temporary balloon of these last weeks, the old self seemed unprecedentedly heavier than the surrounding atmosphere. To this deflated Bernard the savage showed himself unexpectedly sympathetic. "You're more like what you were at Malpais," he said when Bernard had told him his plaintive story. "Do you remember when we first talked together outside the little house? You're like what you were then." "Because I'm unhappy again, that's why." "Well, I'd rather be unhappy than have the sort of false lying happiness you were having here." "I like that," said Bernard bitterly. "When it was you who were the cause of it all, refusing to come to my party and so turning them all against me." He knew that what he was saying was absurd in its injustice. He admitted inwardly, at last even out loud, the truth of all that the savage now said about the worthlessness of friends who could be turned upon so slightly a provocation into persecuting enemies. But in spite of this knowledge and these admissions, in spite of the fact that his friends' support and sympathy were now his only comfort, Bernard continued perversely to nourish, along with his quite genius revenges to be wreaked upon him. His quite genuine affection, a secret grievance against the savage, to meditate a campaign of small revenges to be wreaked upon him. Nourishing a grievance against the arch community songster was useless. There was no possibility of being revenged on the chief bottler or the assistant predestinator. As a victim, the savage possessed for Bernard this enormous superiority over the others, that he was accessible. One of the principal functions of a friend is to suffer in a milder and symbolic form, the punishment that we should like, but are unable to inflict upon our enemies. Bernard's other victim friend was Helmholtz. When discomforted, he came and asked once more for his friendship, which in his prosperity he had not thought it was worth his while to preserve. Helmholtz gave it, and gave it without reproach, without a comment, as though he had forgotten that there had even been a quarrel. Touched, Bernard felt himself at the same time humiliated by the magnanimity, a magnanimity the more extraordinary and therefore the more humiliating, in that it owed nothing to Soma, everywhere to Helmholtz's character. It was the Helmholtz of daily life who forgot and forgave, the Helmholtz of a half a gram holiday. Bernard was duly grateful. It was an enormous comfort to have his friend again, and also duly resentful. It would be pleasure to take some revenge on Helmholtz for his generosity. At their first meeting after the estrangement, Bernard poured out the tale of his misery and accepted consolation. It was not till some days later that he learned, to his surprise, and with a twinge of shame, that he was not the only one who had been in trouble. Helmholtz had also come into conflict with authority. "It was over some rhymes," he explained. "I was giving my usual course of advanced emotional engineering to third-year students, 12 lectures, of which the 7th is about rhymes, on the use of rhymes in moral propaganda and advertisement, to be precise. I always illustrate my lectures with a lot of technical examples. This time I thought I'd give them one I'd just written myself. Pure madness, of course, but I couldn't resist." He laughed. "I was curious to see what their reaction would be. Besides," he added more gravely, "I wanted to do a bit of propaganda. I was trying to engineer them into feeling as I'd felt when I'd written the rhymes." "Ford," he laughed again. "What an outcry there was. The principal had me up and threatened to hand me the immediate sack. I'm a marked man." "But what were your rhymes?" Bernard asked. "They were about being alone." Bernard's eyebrows went up. "I'll recite them to you if you like." And Helmholtz began. "Yesterday's committee, sticks but a broken drum. Midnight in the city, flutes in a vacuum. Shut lips, sleeping faces, every stopped machine, the dumb and littered places where crowds have been. All silences rejoice, weep loudly or low, speak but with the voice of whom I don't know. Absence, say, of Susan's, absentee of Erigina's, arms and respective bosoms, lips and posteriors, slowly form a presence whose, and I ask of what, so absurd in essence, that something which is not, nevertheless should populate empty night more solidly than that with which we copulate. Why should it seem so squalidly? Well, I gave them that as an example, and they reported me to the principal. I'm not surprised, said Bernard. It's flatly against all their sleep teaching. Remember, there's at least 250,000 warnings against solitude. I know, but I thought I'd like to see what effect would be. Well, you've seen now. Helmholtz only laughed. I feel, he said, after a silence, as though I were just beginning to have something to write about, as though I were beginning to be able to use that power. I feel I've got inside me, that extra latent power. Something seems to be coming to me. In spite of all his troubles, he seemed, Bernard thought, profoundly happy. Helmholtz and the savage took to one another at once, so cordially indeed that Bernard felt a sharp pang of jealousy. In all these weeks, he had never come so close in intimacy with the savage as Helmholtz immediately achieved. Watching them, listening to their talk, he found himself sometimes resentfully wishing that he had never brought them together. He was ashamed of his jealousy, and alternately made efforts of will, and took Soma to keep himself from feeling it. But the efforts were not very successful, and between the Soma holiday and there were of necessity intervals. The odious sentiment kept on returning. At his third meeting with the savage, Helmholtz recited his rhyme on solitude. What do you think of them? He asked when he was done. The savage shook his head. Listen to this, was his answer, and unlocked the drawer in which he kept his mouse-eaten book, Shakespeare. He opened and read, Let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, herald sad and trumpet be. Helmholtz listened with a growing excitement. At sole Arabian tree. He stared at thou shrieking harbinger. He smiled with sudden pleasure at every foul of tyrant ring. The blood rushed into his cheeks, but at defunct music he turned pale, trembled with an unprecedented emotion. The savage read on. Property was thus appalled, that the self was not the same, single nature's double name. Neither two nor one was called, reason itself confounded, saw division growing together. Orgy, porgy, said Bernard, interrupting the reading with a loud, unpleasant laugh. It's just a solitary service hymn. He was revenging himself on his two friends for liking one another more than they liked him. In the course of their next 2 or 3 meetings, he frequently repeated the little act of vengeance. It was simple, and since both Helmholtz and the savage were dreadfully pained by the shattering and defilement of a favorite poetic crystal, extremely effective. In the end, Helmholtz threatened to kick him out of the room if he dared to interrupt again, and yet, strangely enough, the next interruption, the most graceful of all, came from Helmholtz himself. Helmholtz. The savage was reading Romeo and Juliet aloud, reading for all the time he was seeing himself as Romeo and Lenina as Juliet, with an intense, quivering passion. Helmholtz had listened to the scene of the lovers' first meeting with a puzzled interest. The scene in the orchard had delighted him with its poetry, but the sentiment expressed had made him smile. Getting into such a state about having a girl, it seemed rather ridiculous, but taken detail by verbal detail with a superb piece of emotional engineering. That old fellow, he said. He makes our breast propaganda techniques look absolutely silly. The savage smiled triumphantly and resumed his reading. All went tolerably well until in the last scene of the third act, Capulet and Lady Capulet began to bully Juliet to marry Paris. Helmholtz had been restless through the entire scene, but when pathetically mimed by the savage, Juliet cried out, Is there no pity sitting in the clouds that sees in the bottom of my grief? Oh, my mother, cast me not away, delay this marriage for a month, a week, or if you do not make the bridal bed in that dimmed monument where Tybalt lies. When Juliet said this, Helmholtz broke out an explosion of uncontrollable guffawing. The mother and father, grotesque obscenities, forcing the daughter to have someone she didn't want, and the idiotic girl not saying that she was having someone else whom, for the moment at any rate, she preferred. In its smutty absurdity, the situation was irresistibly comical. He had managed with a heroic effort to hold down the mounting pressure of his hilarity, but sweet mother in the savage's tremulous tone of anguish, and the reference to Tybalt's lying dead, but evidently uncremated and wasting his phosphorus on a dim monument, were too much for him. He laughed and laughed till the tears streamed down his face quenchlessly, laughed while pale with a sense of outrage, and the savage looked at him over the top of his book, and then, after the laughter still continued, closed it indignantly, got up, and with a gesture of one who removed his pearl from before swine, locked it away in the drawer. "And yet," said Helmholtz, when he, having recovered his breath enough to apologize, he had mollified the savage into listening to his explanation, "I know quite well that one needs ridiculous mad situations like that. One can't write really well about anything else. Why was the old fellow such a marvelous why was that old fellow such a marvelous propaganda technician? Because he had so many insane, excruciating things to get excited about. You've got to be hurt and upset. Otherwise, you can't think of the really good, penetrating, X-rayish phrases. But mothers and fathers," he shook his head. "You can't expect me to keep a straight face about mothers and fathers. And who's going to get excited about a boy having a girl and not having her?" The savage winced, but Helmholtz, who was staring pensively at the floor, saw nothing. "No," he concluded with a sigh, "it won't do. We need some other kind of madness and violence. But what? What? Where can one find it?" He was silent, then shaking his head. "I don't know," he said at last. "I don't know." End of chapter 12.